Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
There's a specific kind of silence that wraps around you when you're standing in a room full of people who are smiling, laughing, raising glasses, and yet somehow, despite all that noise, you know without a doubt that no one sees you. That kind of silence doesn't just settle in your ears, it crawls into your skin. And last Saturday night, as I stood in my own dining room, in the house I cleaned, in the kitchen I cooked in, watching my mother raise a glass and thank my sister for making her proud, I felt that silence wrap itself around me like a damn straitjacket. The whole thing was my idea, from the catered cake down to the playlist. My mother turned 67. I told myself that no matter how rocky things had been over the years, we'd gather for a nice dinner. We'd pretend like we were still a normal family. And for the first couple of hours, I almost believed it. Amanda brought her 2 kids, one of them spilled juice on my rug, and my mother did what she always does, sat like some aging queen, accepting praise for sacrifices she never made. Dad, as usual, was half present, nodding and checking his watch like he was waiting for a commercial break. But I smiled. I passed the salad. I poured the wine. I even ironed a tablecloth, for God's sake. And then, just as the cake was brought out, candles flickering and everyone gathered around with their phones out, Evelyn, my mother, though she hates when I call her that, stood and tapped her glass with a knife. Just 3 soft taps, but enough to pull the air out of the room. She smiled, lifted her glass, and said, "I just want to say, thank you all for being here. I've had a good life. A real good life. And I have so much to be thankful for. Especially Amanda, for making me proud every single day with the way she raises her kids and keeps her family together. You're everything I ever hoped my daughter would become." And just like that, the silence I mentioned, it screamed in my ears. I didn't say anything. I didn't even flinch. I just smiled like some wax figure on autopilot and started collecting the glasses around the table, one by one, the way I always do when I'm trying to escape without making a scene. No one noticed. Not Amanda. Not Evelyn. Not even Dad, who was too busy reaching for his phone to take a blurry photo of the candles before they melted into the frosting. I didn't wait for dessert. I mumbled something about needing to get up early, hugged the kids, and left my own house before anyone could stop me. I went straight to my car, turned off the radio, and drove around the block 3 times before I could feel my hands again. I didn't cry, because women like me, we don't cry in cars. We clench our jaws, stare ahead, and make mental lists of things to clean or fix just to feel like we have some control over something. Anything. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen counter in the dark, drinking room-temperature wine and replaying Evelyn's words in my head like a scratched record. "You're everything I ever hoped my daughter would become." 8 words that turned me, her actual daughter, into wallpaper. The next morning, just as the sun came up and cast that ugly yellow light across the hardwood floors, my phone buzzed. It was Amanda. The message was simple. Cold. Calculated, even if she didn't mean it to be. "She's been crying since you left. Did something happen?" At first, I thought maybe she was trying to be kind. Maybe she was trying to bridge the gap with a vague concern, like a passive invitation to explain myself, to beg for clarity, to play the older sister card and pretend that everything was just a misunderstanding. But the more I read it, the more I realized it wasn't concern. It was guilt, neatly disguised as curiosity. The kind of message you send when you want to feel like a good person, but don't want to know the actual answer. So, I didn't respond. Instead, I did something worse. I smiled. See, here's the thing people like Amanda never understand. When someone's been invisible their whole life, when they've watched their sister get the hugs, the praise, the credit, the gentle scolding while you get the cold shoulder and the tight-lipped nod, when you've stood in the wings clapping for every small achievement she's made while your own victories barely registered, you stop wanting attention. You start wanting truth. And once that craving for truth sets in, it eats at you like rust under the paint. That morning, I sat down with a legal pad and a cup of burnt coffee and wrote a single word at the top of the page, ledger. Underneath it, I started listing things, not just moments like the birthday toast, but all the small, sharp jabs I'd endured since I was old enough to notice them. Evelyn's absence from my high school graduation. Amanda's accidental forgetting to invite me to her baby shower. The time I drove 3 hours in a snowstorm to help Mom with her surgery recovery, only for her to tell Amanda later, "It was lonely without you here." Every entry I wrote made me breathe a little deeper. Not because I was feeling better, but because I was remembering. And remembering is dangerous when you've spent years convincing yourself that forgetting was the only way to stay sane. So no, I didn't answer Amanda's message. I didn't call Evelyn back either when she texted later with a pathetic, "Hope you're okay, sweetheart." Instead, I made a decision. I would give them exactly what they've always given me: politeness, distance, and just enough discomfort to keep them wondering what they did wrong without ever telling them. Because that's the real revenge, isn't it? Not the yelling. Not the drama. But the quiet that follows when you stop giving people the privilege of your pain. And if Amanda thinks Evelyn's crying now, she hasn't seen anything yet. There's a certain kind of memory that doesn't come to you all at once, like a scene in a movie or the snapshot of a holiday photo. It arrives in pieces, like fragments of glass spilled across the floor, each one catching light a little differently depending on how long you're willing to stare into it. And as I sat there in my kitchen, the aftertaste of that bitter dinner still sitting somewhere between my chest and my throat, I didn't need to think hard to remember that my mother's little toast wasn't some isolated slip of the tongue or an innocent oversight. It was a continuation of a long, carefully orchestrated performance that began years ago, long before Amanda had children or a mortgage or even her own name written on the mailbox. It's funny, really, how we're taught to measure love in words, in hugs, in birthday cards or voicemails with the word "sweetheart" at the end, but when I look back, I measure my mother's affection in what wasn't said, in the silences that stretched between events like caution tape. I was 14 the first time I noticed it, not a suspicion, not a feeling, but an actual, tangible realization, and I remember the moment with surgical clarity. I had won a statewide essay contest, something no one in my class had ever done before, and the school held an assembly in the gym where they called my name out over the loudspeakers and handed me a little blue plaque that I still keep in a drawer under my tax forms. My English teacher had called Evelyn, asked her to attend, even offered to drive her if transportation was an issue, but she didn't show. When I got home that night, cheeks flushed with the glow of accomplishment and just the faintest bit of hope that she'd have changed her mind and made it. After all, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a magazine and eating a tuna sandwich. She didn't even ask how it went. "I thought you'd be tired," she said when I lingered in the doorway, holding the plaque in both hands like a peace offering. And those things run long. Fast forward 6 years, Amanda, then just a junior in high school, entered a regional dance competition, one of those things where every kid wins some kind of ribbon, but the important part is what happens afterward. Mom rented a hotel room near the venue. She made t-shirts with Amanda's name on them. She brought roses, actual roses, which she handed to Amanda the second she stepped off stage, regardless of the fact that she'd fumbled a turn and missed half a beat in the final sequence. I was there too, of course, sitting in the audience, clapping, holding the camcorder Evelyn had asked me to manage, even though I had a final paper due the next morning. That moment cemented something in my chest that has never quite gone away, a slow-forming resentment that didn't look like anger on the outside, not at first. It looked like helpfulness. It looked like self-sufficiency. It looked like stepping in to do dishes at family dinners without being asked, or remembering to pick up prescriptions, or driving Mom to doctor appointments while Amanda couldn't get away from her Pilates class or a PTA meeting. I wore that helpfulness like armor for so many years, thinking it made me noble, or at the very least necessary. But eventually, you start to see it for what it is, a role that was handed to you before you knew you had the right to say no. So, after Amanda sent that ridiculous message the next morning, and I decided to finally confront not her, not Evelyn, but the timeline of all the small, deliberate choices that led me to this point, I dug out the black spiral-bound notebook I kept in the back of my hallway closet, tucked behind a box of old Christmas ornaments and tax returns. It wasn't some diary with hearts and lockets on the cover, it was a ledger. That's what I'd written on the first page in block letters with a permanent marker, ledger. A record. A private archive of injustices too small to say out loud without sounding petty, and too big to ignore without losing a piece of your soul each time you let them slide. I flipped through pages of notes scribbled in different pens from different years, annotations from various stages of my life, like an emotional forensic file. There was the time I spent $300 on a Mother's Day spa package, and Evelyn told Amanda later that she doesn't care for massages because strangers touching her makes her anxious. There was a Christmas where I bought her a wool coat she'd been eyeing, and she asked if I kept the receipt because gray makes her look washed out. I had written it all down. Not because I intended to use it, but because I needed to remember that I wasn't crazy. People like Evelyn are experts at making you doubt your own experience, spinning their favoritism into stories about personality differences or just how things turned out. But the truth lives in the patterns. And once you've seen enough of them, you can't unsee them. It wasn't just about Amanda being the favorite, it was about me being the fallback. The second thought. The support beam that keeps the house from crumbling, but never gets painted, never gets praised, never even gets noticed until it's cracked and the whole place threatens to fall down. And the worst part? I'd helped build that dynamic with my own hands. I'd shown up. I'd fixed the messes. I'd swallowed the hurt and kept my voice steady because someone had to be the adult. But now I was 42 years old, and all I had to show for it was a mother who forgot to include me in the only toast that was ever made in my honor, in my own house, surrounded by my own food and my own wine. So I circled a date in the notebook. Just one. Next Saturday. It wasn't Amanda's birthday. It wasn't a holiday. It was just a day I knew she'd be home. I had a plan. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive. Just a small shift. A crack in the wall. The kind of move that doesn't seem like much at first until the entire structure starts to lean. Because I wasn't trying to get even. I was trying to be remembered. There is something uniquely satisfying about watching someone squirm without them realizing that they're doing it, like when a person shifts in their seat while telling a half-truth, unsure if they've said too much or not enough. Or when their voice raises just slightly at the edges while insisting they're not upset, even though every word they say tastes like panic. I didn't go to Amanda's house that Saturday with any grand scheme or confrontation in mind. There were no dramatic monologues planned. No childhood memories laid out like ammunition in my purse, but what I did bring was something far more dangerous. Time, calculation, and the quiet kind of anger that doesn't scream or shatter, but coils itself around each sentence like a noose, tightening slowly while the other person thinks the conversation is still safe. I texted her late Friday night, something casual, something that could be read as kindness if she squinted. Hey, I still have a few dishes of yours from Mom's dinner. Want me to swing by and drop them off tomorrow? And within minutes she replied, cheerful and clueless as always, sure. Come by in the morning if that works. I'll make coffee. I knew it wasn't about the dishes. She knew it wasn't about the dishes. But neither of us was going to admit that, not yet. Her house looked exactly like it always did, perfect, curated, the kind of suburban polished that screams effortlessness, but reeks of exhaustion if you know what to look for. The bushes were trimmed into oblivion. There was a seasonal wreath on the front door even though it was barely October, and her husband's Tesla was angled just enough in the driveway to signal status without arrogance. Amanda opened the door in yoga pants and a sweater that looked like it cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Her hair twisted up like she was effortlessly pretty without trying. She smiled wide, a smile I'd seen hundreds of times at school plays, at bridal showers, at awkward Thanksgiving dinners when we both pretended we had nothing to fight about. We made small talk as I handed her the glass casserole dish and the 2 dessert plates I'd cleaned and packed carefully in a canvas tote. She complimented my haircut. I complimented her kitchen remodel. We exchanged all the necessary pleasantries like trained diplomats engaging in a ceasefire. But I could feel it, underneath the words, that ripple of unease starting to build, like she knew something was coming but couldn't name it yet. After a few minutes, she poured us both coffee and sat across from me at the marble island, her kids thankfully occupied with cartoons in the next room. That's when I started. Not directly, not with anything pointed, but with the kind of conversation that feels harmless until you realize the walls are getting smaller and you're not sure when they started moving. You know, I said, stirring my coffee slowly, I've been thinking a lot about that dinner. Not in a bad way, just how everyone responded to Mom's toast. Amanda blinked, her smile tightening just a bit, the kind of reaction someone gives when they're unsure whether they're being complimented or warned. Yeah, it was really sweet of her to say that. She's not always the most expressive, so it meant a lot to hear that out loud. I nodded, taking a small sip. It really did. I mean, you could tell how much pride she has in you. In your family. It's powerful. The way she lit up when she talked about you. That's when Amanda shifted slightly, just a breath, barely perceptible, but enough for me to know I'd nudged something loose. She tilted her head, cautious now. Well, I think she's proud of both of us in different ways. You've always been so independent, and you've done really well with your career, and she always talks about how strong you are. Strong. That word again. Always strong. Always dependable. The one you don't need to check on because she's got it covered. The one who gets applause in silence and support in theory, but never in presence. I smiled, not unkindly. Sure. But pride looks different when it's said out loud, doesn't it? Amanda's cheeks flushed slightly, whether from guilt or discomfort, I couldn't tell yet. I mean, maybe she just doesn't always know how to express it the same way. I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap, letting the pause hang between us like a curtain. Maybe. Or maybe she's just gotten used to not having to express it to me, because I never expected it from her the way you did. Amanda stiffened, the smile finally dropping just a fraction. What's that supposed to mean? I let my eyes wander across her kitchen, every surface clean, every photo frame arranged just so, the perfect domestic tableau, and then I looked back at her. Just that I used to think she loved you more. You know, because of how she treated you. But now, I wonder if it's not about love at all. Maybe it's guilt. The word landed like a dropped glass. Amanda flinched, and not in a theatrical way, but in that deeply human way that tells you you've hit something real. Guilt, she echoed, her voice suddenly brittle. I didn't press. I didn't elaborate. I simply reached for my coffee, took one final sip, and stood. Anyway, I should let you get on with your morning. Tell the kids I said hi. She stood too, slower now, the mug in her hands untouched, her mouth slightly parted like there were questions forming she didn't quite know how to ask. I gave her a soft smile at the door, the kind that looks warm but feels like ice if you stand too close to it. As I walked back to my car, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was control, not loud or theatrical, but the quiet kind, the kind that comes from watching someone start to doubt the version of the story they've always believed was true. That night, just as I was brushing my teeth and preparing to go to bed, my phone lit up on the counter. It was Amanda. What did you mean by guilt? I didn't answer right away. I let it sit there, glowing in the dark. Let her think. Let her wonder. Because I wasn't just talking about Evelyn anymore. And I think, for the first time in her life, Amanda knew that. There are things families carry like secrets and things families carry like weights, but there are also things that families bury so deeply they become part of the foundation. Invisible and untouchable until someone digs far enough into the floorboards to feel the shift beneath their feet. For most of my life, I didn't speak about Michael, not because I didn't think of him, not because he didn't matter to me, but because, in our house, his name was treated like a ghost in the walls. You could sense him. Feel the coldness of his absence at holidays, see the tightness in my mother's shoulders whenever someone brought up the year 1984, but no one ever acknowledged that he had once existed as a person with a laugh and a bedroom and a favorite cereal. My brother, the firstborn, the prototype, the one Evelyn rarely mentioned except in those few whispered conversations with my father when they thought I was asleep, was erased so thoroughly from the public face of our family that, by the time Amanda was old enough to ask why there were only 2 children in the framed photos on the mantel, my mother simply said, "That's all there ever was." But of course, it wasn't. Michael was 16 when he died, just 3 years before Amanda was born, and I was only 7 at the time, old enough to remember, but too young to be trusted with the truth. The official story, as I came to understand it through hushed fragments and one overheard phone call between Evelyn and her sister, was that it was an accident. A car crash. No details. No questions. No open discussion. I remember walking into the kitchen one evening and seeing my mother standing over the sink, her hands plunged deep into dishwater that had long gone cold, her eyes locked on the window but not seeing anything beyond it. She didn't hear me come in. She just stood there, unmoving, as the faucet continued to drip in slow, rhythmic drops, and then, without warning, she made a soft, low sound in her throat, something between a sigh and a sob, and I backed out of the room as quietly as I could. That was the last time I saw her cry. Years later, when I was in college and home for a weekend visit, I stumbled across a file folder tucked deep in the back of my father's filing cabinet, jammed between tax returns and an instruction manual for a lawnmower he no longer owned. Inside were several pages of yellowed paper, some of them typed, others handwritten, all with a strange, hesitant energy to them, as if whoever wrote them wasn't sure whether they were supposed to or not. At the top of one page, in slightly shaky ballpoint ink, were the words, Dr. Keating, Grief Sessions, Evelyn G. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at. Therapy notes. Not official transcripts, but summaries, things my father must have asked for, or perhaps Evelyn had given him voluntarily in a rare moment of openness. And as I read them, one phrase repeated itself over and over again, always slightly altered, but always pointing to the same core wound. I don't think I can ever forgive myself. There was no clear explanation of what she meant, no confession of negligence or guilt, but the implication was thick enough to drown in. The pieces began to form a picture, not a complete one, not yet, but something undeniable, something deeply rotten at the heart of how our family was shaped after Michael was gone. Evelyn hadn't just lost a son, she had lost a version of herself she could no longer face. And in her grief, in her quiet, repressed, ever-composed grief, she hadn't reached for the daughter she still had, the one who was already alive and in front of her, needing affection and security and some sense of continuity in a world that had just shattered around her. Instead, she'd waited. She'd carried her shame in silence and waited for a second chance to start over. Amanda. And when Amanda was born, blonde and quiet and delicate in the ways Evelyn liked to showcase, I believe something shifted in my mother's mind, whether consciously or not, I'll never know, but from that moment on, it was as though Amanda became the redemption arc Evelyn had been writing in her head all along. She dressed her up, photographed her constantly, called her my light, and built a shrine around her milestones while I sat quietly in the corner, old enough to know something was off, but not old enough to demand that someone explain it. It wasn't until Amanda's text, "What did you mean by guilt?" that I realized I could no longer keep this weight to myself, that perhaps the only way to make both of them understand the pain they had woven into our family like wallpaper was to hold up the piece they had tried so desperately to ignore. So I went back to that folder, now stored in a locked drawer in my own home, and I took out the copied notes I had made all those years ago. I placed them gently in a plain white envelope, no return address, no handwriting on the outside except for Amanda's name. And then, just before sealing it, I slipped in a photograph, the only one I still had of Michael, taken at a birthday party in our backyard, where he was holding a balloon and grinning at someone out of frame. Amanda wouldn't recognize him. She'd never seen this boy before. But she would recognize the implications. I mailed it that Monday morning. No fanfare. No message. Just an unopened box of history and consequence dropped quietly into her perfect little world. And when the call came 3 days later, I didn't pick up. I just stared at the screen, Evelyn's name glowing there like a warning flare, and listened to the voicemail through a speaker that made her voice sound even smaller than usual. She didn't yell. She didn't ask why. She just cried soft, slow, gasping sobs that cracked between her sentences like splintered wood, and then finally, after a long pause, said the words that hit me harder than anything I'd expected. "I didn't mean to make you disappear." It wasn't an apology. Not really. It was too late for that, and we both knew it. But it was the first time she admitted I'd been missing in plain sight. And yet, as I sat there in the dark, the phone silent again, I felt no relief. No peace. Only the strange, hollow sense that something was finally shifting beneath the foundation, and I had no idea whether what would rise next would be a ruin or something entirely new. There are certain things you plan to say your whole life, certain words you rehearse in the dark when no one is around to listen, sentences you shape and reshape in your mind like clay, smoothing every rough edge until they're just sharp enough to cut, but not so jagged that they look like vengeance. And yet, when the moment finally arrives, when the weight of those unsaid things is heavier than the silence you've carried them in, something inside you shifts, something subtle but irreversible. And you realize that maybe you don't need to say them after all. Maybe instead, you just need to show the truth, hand it over like a sealed box, and walk away without waiting to see if anyone opens it. That's what I told myself when I slid the envelope addressed to Amanda into the cold, sterile mouth of the mailbox, letting it fall from my hand like a confession I no longer had to speak. Inside it, as she would soon discover, were pieces of a puzzle she never asked for, pieces she likely believed didn't exist, or at least didn't belong to her. The photocopied therapy notes from Evelyn's long-ago grief counseling sessions, the brief, disjointed fragments of sorrow and shame that spoke volumes between the lines, and the photograph, creased at the edges, slightly faded from time, of Michael, frozen in a moment of careless joy that had lived in a drawer for decades, untouched and unseen. I imagined Amanda opening the envelope in her spotless kitchen, perhaps while her husband scrolled through emails and her children watched television in the other room, and I imagined the confusion first, then the recognition, then, if I was lucky, the slow unraveling of certainty, the crack that would widen until she could no longer pretend her version of the family story was the only one that mattered. I never signed the letter. I never included a message. But I knew she would understand exactly who it came from. The irony, of course, is that Evelyn's birthday dinner, the one she had been so careful to curate with her carefully chosen toast, her subtle omission, her performance of maternal pride so laser-focused on Amanda that it turned the rest of us into background noise, was never really a celebration at all. It was a stage, and she had played her role so convincingly for so many years that she genuinely believed the applause was real. But I had grown tired of being in the audience. I had grown tired of clapping with numb hands while watching someone else receive credit for a role I had been playing in silence. So the envelope, in all its quiet brutality, was my gift, not to Amanda, and certainly not to Evelyn, but to myself. A gift of release. A gift of clarity. The birthday gift I never gave, wrapped not in paper, but in truth. 3 days passed before Amanda responded. Her message arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered not as a call or a voicemail, but as a single text, precise, restrained, and devoid of punctuation, as if she'd typed it in a rush and couldn't bear to linger long enough to make it pretty. "Why would you do this?" I read it once. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because that single question told me more than a paragraph ever could. It meant she had read everything. It meant she had recognized the boy in the photo. It meant she understood that the center of our family was not, and never had been, as stable or as simple as she'd wanted it to be. And most importantly, it meant the story she'd been told: we are a normal family, everything is fine, Mom loves us both equally, was no longer intact. That question, simple as it was the beginning of the unraveling. The day after that, Evelyn called. Or rather, she tried to. The first attempt came mid-morning, then again in the late afternoon. By evening, there were 4 missed calls and 1 voicemail waiting on my phone, her name flashing across the screen like a beacon from a ship that had finally noticed it was lost at sea. I didn't answer the calls. I only listened to the voicemail once, sitting in the dark at my kitchen table, the same place I had sat after her birthday, where this entire shift had begun. Her voice, once so clipped and authoritative, sounded fragile now, like someone speaking through a fog she didn't understand. She didn't say my name. She didn't ask me to explain. She simply cried, a soft, irregular sound that stretched out for a full 30 seconds before she finally whispered, almost to herself, "I didn't know she'd show it to you. I didn't think you'd remember him." And then silence. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just the sound of a woman coming face to face with the one truth she had spent her entire motherhood trying to avoid, that in trying to erase her own pain, she had erased her daughter's presence. I didn't delete the message. I didn't save it either. I just let it sit there, unplayed, in the same place I had let so many other things sit, birthdays uncelebrated, achievements unmentioned, grief unacknowledged. But I felt something else that night, something unexpected, and it wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't revenge, not in the theatrical sense. What I felt, standing there barefoot in my kitchen with the light of the refrigerator spilling onto the floor and the silence pressing in from all sides, was something much quieter and far more complicated than victory. I felt done. Not angry. Not triumphant. Just done. It's strange how people talk about closure like it's this neat, clean ending, like a period at the end of a sentence or the closing of a door. But what I've learned is that real closure is much messier than that. It doesn't come when someone finally apologizes or admits they were wrong. It comes when you realize you no longer need them to. It comes when you stop waiting for a reconciliation that was never going to happen and instead decide to make peace with the version of events that you saw with your own eyes, even if no one else ever agrees with it. The next morning, I went for a walk past the little shops downtown, the ones with overpriced candles and clever signs in the windows. The kind of places I used to avoid because they reminded me of things I could never quite afford or people I didn't know how to be. And as I passed one display, I stopped, not because it was beautiful or sentimental, but because of the sign in the window, printed in thick white letters across a black background like some cynical greeting card. It said, "Family isn't always who raised you." I stood there for a moment, staring at it, and I didn't smile. Not really, but I did feel something loosen in my chest, something that had been coiled there for decades. Because whoever wrote that sign, whether they knew it or not, had understood something Evelyn never could. And maybe Amanda would someday. Or maybe not. But for the first time, I didn't need to know. Because the most powerful revenge isn't in destruction, it's in detachment. It's in reclaiming the space they took from you and deciding, on your own terms, that you no longer need their permission to exist fully, to feel completely, to walk away clean. And if there's anything left to say, maybe it's just this. Sometimes, silence is not the absence of love. It's the end of waiting for it.